My name is Nicole Ardwin, and I'm a faculty member in the Environmental Social Sciences group here in the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. It is truly my pleasure and honor to be serving as the chair for this defense. As many of you know, I was the former faculty director of E-IPER, and which was an incredible pleasure. One of the huge drawbacks, perhaps the only drawback of that role, was that I didn't get to chair defenses. And so truly being asked to do this by Erica, I was thrilled. I'm also on sabbatical this year, and so I'm not here on campus, and it just happened to be that I was here this week for meetings. And so I think that there was someone looking out for us to make this happen. So thank you, Erica, for asking me to serve in this role. So with that out of the way, I would like to welcome all of you to this monumental occasion where Erica is going to be presenting about her dissertation, the title of which is Planned Relocation of Communities in a Changing Climate, Assessing Risk Reduction, Livelihoods, and Justice Outcomes to Inform Governance. After the successful completion of the university oral examination, we hope to formally award Erica a PhD in Environment and Resources. We would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We recognize that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and of inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. As part of Erica's examination committee, I am pleased to be joined by her lead advisors. We have Professor Chris Field, who is her co-advisor, the Melvin and Joan Lane Professor of Interdisciplinary Environmental Studies, the Perry L. McCarty Director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, Professor of Earth System Science, Professor of Biology, and Senior Fellow at the Precourt and Institute for Energy and the Woods Institute for the Environment. Well, there's about 4 more titles here. And Professor Gabrielle Wong-Perotti, who is also a co-advisor and Assistant Professor of Earth System Science, a Center Fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment, and Assistant Professor in the Environmental Social Sciences group in the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. As well as the other members of her dissertation reading committee, we have Siders, who's here joining us from the University of Delaware. So thank you so much for joining us from across the country. She's an associate professor at University of Delaware, recently awarded tenure. Congratulations, Siders. And director of the Gerard J. Mangone Climate Change Center Science and Policy Hub. And Michelle Anderson, the Larry Kramer Professor of Law at the Stanford Law School, Professor at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability, and Senior Fellow in the Woods Institute for the Environment. After Erica has finished her presentation, members of the audience will have the opportunity to congratulate her and join us for a reception. Before all of that, you will also have the opportunity to ask her questions, so we will help field those questions here. And between the questions and the reception, we will have a closed-door session with just the committee. So between those two, you can all go outside, enjoy the gorgeous day, and then we'll meet you on the balcony outside for a reception. So now to do the important work of introducing Erica, I'm going to turn it over to her co-advisors, to Gabrielle and Chris. And again, welcome to all of you for being here.
Thank you, Nicole. I have been thinking about what to say for a while now, and this morning had the opportunity to go back in time and look at some of our earliest correspondence. And our time together started actually right when I started in February of 2019, when I had the opportunity to look through all of the E-IPER applicants, and I came across yours. And on paper, stunning, kind of like, oh my goodness, look at this person. She's doing incredible work looking at the intersection of climate mobility, climate impacts, and human rights. Just amazing set of qualifications and the things that you had already accomplished at that point. And I said, there's no way she's going to be as awesome in person, right? It's always too good to be true. And then I met you, and then I was just looking through the emails, and I was like, oh my goodness, I knew right then that the stars had aligned, and I was just hoping that you would want to come to join us and to join E-IPER. And I'm so glad that you did. And I continued to just be blown away by our interactions. We were exchanging ideas, exchanging papers from day one, just talking about big ideas. It was really inspiring, and it frankly made me feel welcomed and jazzed about being here. It's a little scary here, and so it's just like, this is why I'm here, is to think about these big ideas and to work with incredible people. And so what we're going to see from you today is at least just some of the tip of the iceberg of some of the incredible scholarly body of work that you've done. But through the years, I've also learned a lot about you as a person. So you are an amazingly humble, athlete. You know, you just do these ultra marathons, and I'm just like, and you're just like, yeah, I just did this last weekend, and it was a little hot, or, and I'm just like, oh my goodness, or I'm gonna be doing this backpacking trip, where and then you showed me your whole setup. We've dehydrated this food, and you were doing all this stuff, and I'm like, oh my goodness, you're my idol. You're living the life that I've wanted to live, and I can at least live through you vicariously. But you're also just an incredible, genuine person and genuinely interested in other people. And I remember one of my first memories of you just kind of doing a personal interaction is how you engaged with my daughters, talking about theater and performance and just being really interested in them. And that just really touched me. So I feel lucky to know you, humbled to be in your presence, and honored to have been able to spend the last several years with you. And I hope to continue engaging and be able to kind of have those remarkable and inspiring interactions for years to come. So thank you, Erica.
I was in a meeting yesterday with a distinguished geographer from Columbia named Ruth DeFries. Ruth was Erica's undergraduate mentor. And most professors don't remember students after the term ends, and certainly not for 6, 7 years. But Ruth launched into this long kind of panegyric about how wonderful it had been to work with Erica and how she had been so inspired by Erica's work and felt like the sense of dynamism between them was something that had really launched a whole new phase of Ruth's thinking in addition to Erica's. And I think that's the real measure of success of graduate students, the extent to which they change the environment, not just their own thinking. There are lots of people who come to do PhD programs who love the research. They love building the gizmo, solving the equation, traveling to the field site. And that's, Erica does that, but it's not really who she is. When I think about what Erica brings to the work, it's a deep commitment to addressing the needs of the people whose environment she's studying. And I find that to be an incredibly kind of uplifting approach to the way you think about what your scholarship is. That I'm going to do whatever needs to be done, and do the exciting parts and the unpleasant parts in order to uplift the people who are the subjects of my study. And I find that to be a frame that speaks to a kind of a higher purpose of doing a PhD, and it's one I'm confident that Erica will continue with. Erica really brings 3 things to the program. Gabrielle already spoke to the fact that her dedication to accomplishing tasks is super impressive, particularly when it involves walking or running for hundreds of miles. And the other thing that Erica has brought in addition to this ability to really focus is an ability to take things in stride. And one of the features that all PhD students encounter is the ups and downs of an analysis not working, a paper being rejected on the first submission, having a pandemic that changes what you have to do. Life has thrown a lot of curveballs at Erica's program, and of all the students I've ever worked with, she's probably been the most, I won't say unaffected, but the quickest to regain a positive attitude, and that's something I've benefited from as well. And I think the whole E-IPER program, the whole Stanford community has. So I'll turn it over to Erica for her presentation now.
Thank you. Wow, thank you for those incredibly kind introductions, Chris and Gabrielle and Nicole. Really, really appreciate it. So my talk today is titled The Planned Relocation of Communities in a Changing Climate, Risk Reduction, Livelihoods, and Justice. To start, I want to tell you the story of a small community off the coast of Panama called Gardi Sugdub. They have loved this island for over 100 years. Yet life is hard because, as you can see, there's just no space. And floods and sea level rise have threatened their access to drinking water, sanitation, and education. The school is quite literally falling into the sea. As a result, back in 2010, the community made a challenging decision to relocate to a safer site on the mainland. They plan to move from this tiny island off the coast to this new site called E-IPER. It's a visually striking contrast. After years of waiting, the site will finally be ready later this month, in May. What will happen? Will people stay? Will they be better off? Will they be safer? Will they perceive the move to be just? Only time will tell. My journey to these questions started in May 2013, when I first interviewed communities in Upper Mustang district of Nepal that were relocating because of water scarcity and drought. Years later, in 2017, I sat in the meeting halls of the Palais des Nations in Geneva, leading the United Nations contributions to a toolbox for how you undertake these relocations in a rights-respecting manner. In 2019, right before coming to Stanford, I had the chance to work in the Philippines and learn about these challenges from a local governance perspective. Throughout these experiences, I learned that this is not a future hypothetical, but a current reality. Whole communities are already moving because of climate change impacts, but policies don't often exist to protect their rights, and when they do, they're not necessarily well informed. Decision makers need better evidence to make better decisions. Which leads me to, fast forward 5 years, my talk today. My doctoral research aims to contribute to a growing body of evidence about the outcomes and the governance of these community-wide planned relocations. I aim to contribute to theory, but I also aim to generate practical insights for policymakers and practitioners that are grappling with these challenges. You'll notice this dual motivation throughout my talk. In broad strokes, I'm going to first introduce this concept of planned relocation. I'll talk about outcomes from 3 perspectives, and I'll conclude by proposing a new conceptual framework and some ways forward. All right, let's dive in. So, as all of you are very well aware, climate change will make many hazards more intense and frequent. But today, our focus is on sea level rise and floods. These are hazards that are already threatening the habitability of land and endangering people's lives, livelihoods, and the very idea of home. Facing these sobering realities, communities and governments are exploring approaches to reduce risks and adapt. Adaptation efforts typically fall into 3 categories. First, measures to resist, like putting up a seawall. Measures to accommodate a hazard, like putting a house on stilts. And finally, measures to move away from the hazard itself. This phenomenon has many names, sometimes called managed retreat or resettlement, but here we call it planned relocation. People want to stay in their homes. Movement is traumatic. It's often considered a measure of last resort. Yet it's increasingly discussed as an adaptation option. Unlike these more incremental strategies, planned relocation has the potential to eliminate flood exposure completely, and under the right conditions, it can be societally transformational. As the climate crisis accelerates, some movement may be inevitable. Migration scholars will tell you that human movements take different forms. They range from the more forced to the more voluntary, from the temporary to the permanent. Planned relocation is unique among this landscape of ways that people move because it takes place at a community scale, it's intended to be permanent, there's a shared destination site, And there's an external actor, often a government, that provides support or assistance. Well-planned relocation can be a way to avoid the high emotional, social, and economic costs of forced displacement. It can also be a durable solution for people who've already been displaced. According to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center report just published yesterday, 26.4 million people were displaced in the year 2023 alone in the context of disasters. This number is growing over time. So when well-planned relocation can help avert, minimize, and address displacement, getting this right could help millions of people. Despite the rising salience of this phenomenon, empirical research is limited and characterized by at least 3 gaps. First, most research to date is single case studies, which are vitally important to understand complexity, but they don't necessarily allow us to see patterns across contexts that might be helpful for generalizable and policy-relevant insights. Second, most research relies on a single disciplinary perspective, which prevents the assessment of trade-off across domains. Finally, there's little systematic focus on outcomes, which is critical because many planned relocations have mixed track records. Alongside risk reduction, they also undermine people's cultural practices and the protection of their rights. Much of what we assume we know about this phenomenon of climate-related relocation comes from analogies to development or dam-related resettlements, which are different contexts and have somewhat limited applicability. So to address these 3 gaps, my dissertation leverages comparative and unapologetically interdisciplinary approaches to assess outcomes. So one of my committee members, CIDers, in my first year here told me that if there's something that's bothering you, it's probably an important research direction. My first year, my biggest pet peeve was this word success. I saw it everywhere, in the media, in policy reports, in conversations with other researchers, cases like Vuni de Lagoa in Fiji and Valmeyer in Illinois labeled as planned relocation success stories. And this has been happening since the 1990s. But still, a unified consensus on what this term success means doesn't exist. Ultimately, what is success in a planned relocation? How do we measure it? And then what might contribute to more successful outcomes? These deceivingly complex questions are front and center in the minds of policymakers and practitioners, and they're the core motivation for my dissertation research today. These questions are, of course, not unique to planned relocation. Broader conversations in the fields of managed retreat, climate adaptation, and climate mobility are also reckoning with this question of what is success. Across 5 chapters, my dissertation intends to interrogate this concept. But first, Chapter 1 is a global mapping. Where have these cases taken place to date? Chapter 2 views this question of success from the lens of risk reduction through spatial analysis. Chapter 3 views this question of success through livelihoods, using qualitative comparative analysis. And Chapter 4 views this question of success through the lens of justice by analyzing focus groups. Across these chapters, I bring together diverse disciplinary perspectives. Climate scientists who are focusing on risk reduction might not always be thinking about the justice perspectives, and vice versa. I won't have time today to discuss all of these chapters in depth, but I aim to provide a flavor of each to give you an idea of the types of insights that are possible when we bring diverse disciplinary views together in conversation on an issue as thorny and multidimensional as planned relocation. You'll notice a spectrum of methods throughout these chapters, from the more quantitative to the more qualitative, and that the implications become more complex over time. You'll also notice that I ask more questions, which I view as a contribution to this discourse. And finally, Chapter 5 comes back to this key question of success. My goal is to illustrate why we need to break down silos and think about risk, livelihoods, and justice together. We need new approaches to measure outcomes of climate relocation specifically that balance these 3 elements and help navigate the inevitable trade-offs that emerge. Before interrogating this question of success, however, it's necessary to go back to basics. We need to first understand where, why, and how planned relocations have taken place to date. We knew a lot about isolated cases, but we didn't have a global database. So back in 2020, together with my co-author, Sanjula Weerasinghe, who you can see on the screen, and supported by the Platform on Disaster Displacement and the University of New South Wales Caldor Center, we published a white paper and a first-of-its-kind global database of planned relocation cases. We had two research questions. First, where have these planned relocations taken place around the world since 1970? So we turned to English language, academic, and gray literature and compiled a global data set. This, understandably, has some biases. We were looking to English literature, so therefore what we found was cases that are of interest to English language-speaking researchers and institutions. In a second phase, we also wanted to find out more about the well-documented cases. So we analyzed characteristics of 34 of these cases according to a codebook. So what did we learn? Well, we learned that Gardi Sugdub is not alone. This is a global phenomenon. We identified 308 cases in 60 countries on all inhabited continents. You'll notice a hotspot in Asia and the Pacific. Sometimes these relocations were community-initiated. Sometimes they were initiated by governments. Floods were the most common hazard associated with these moves. But it was never floods alone. It was the compound effects of floods, saline intrusion into the water supply, coastal erosion, and anticipation of future sea level rise that prompted the move. And these environmental catalysts were rarely alone. Usually there were economic, political, social, or demographic factors that also contributed to these moves. In this research, we also offered a typology of spatial patterns. So for example, there's case A, Gardi Sugdub, the typical thing that people have in mind when they think of a planned relocation. A community is moving from one place of origin to one destination. But we also found other cases where many communities were being moved to one shared destination site, or one community was being split to many different destinations, raising questions about what happens to communities when they're converging and diverging in this way. And we found other cases that were even more spatially complex. Over 50% of cases were this first type. They were often relatively short distance, less than 2 kilometers, relatively small communities, and over half involved indigenous communities. So here are some high-level takeaways from this first chapter. There is now a publicly available database of planned relocation cases, which you can find at this QR code in the lower left corner of the screen. And really, this is a survey of literature that allowed us to identify a lot of gaps, which we identified in later chapters of this dissertation. We learned, in a nutshell, that planned relocation is a global phenomenon, but every case is unique, including by their spatial pattern. All right, so jumping to the success question. Given the purpose of a planned relocation, the most intuitive way to think about success is whether or not they've made people safer. It's risk reduction. A post-tsunami planned relocation in the Maldives involved a move from another island, Kondulahodu, to this island, Duvafaru, which was also highly exposed to sea level rise and other coastal hazards. Do planned relocations make people safer today and in the future? Together with my co-authors, Sydney, Sonia, Scott, Gabrielle, and Chris, we ask, does planned relocation reduce the exposure of communities to coastal hazards throughout the 21st century? We assessed all of the planned relocation cases from that global database that met a few key criteria. They were all located within 1 kilometer of the coastline. They all were initiated because of a coastal hazard. They followed a single spatial pattern, that type A. And critically, we could find geolocated site data. So we could find a map or an aerial photograph that allowed us to trace the polygon of the origin and destination. And finally, we could find comparable elevation models. Of the cases in the database, 17 met the criteria. We then combined each community's origin and destination site with sea level rise projections from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report. Together with colleagues at Climate Central, we looked at a range of futures. We considered the effects of sea level rise in the short term, the year 2030, but also the long term, the year 2100. We looked across a range of greenhouse gas emission scenarios, a low emission scenario if we get our act together and have ambitious climate action today, and also a high emission scenario if we continue to use fossil fuels. And finally, we considered sea level rise effects alone and in combination with a once-a-year flooding event. So what does exposure to sea level rise and flooding look like in the most extreme setting, the year 2100, under a high emissions scenario? This map shows that same community off the coast of Panama. You can see in yellow their island, and on black, their new mainland site, E-IPER. This 3.5-kilometer move from a small island to the mainland decreased inundation projections from 100% to 0%. In Taholah, Washington, in the United States, we also see substantial exposure reduction, with the origin site in yellow, 60% flooded, and the destination up on a hill with 0% projected inundation. In contrast, exposure reduction was more modest in the small island to small island relocation of Livelihoods, from 100% inundation in the origin to 66% inundation in the destination. Those three cases represent three different spatial patterns. Island to island move, like the Maldives, island to mainland, like Gardi Sagdeb in Panama, and mainland to mainland, like Taholah in Washington. Each pie chart represents the percentage of the destination or the origin site that is likely to be flooded in blue or not flooded in orange under each emission scenario. You can see on average that there's less floods in the destination sites. You see more orange. That means planned relocations, on average, do make people safer. But reducing risk is not the same as eliminating it. We see more floods under higher emission scenarios and later in the century, towards the year 2100. We also see more floods in island destinations, raising critical questions about the viability of planned relocation as a sustainable adaptation strategy in atoll island nations like the Maldives, where there is no higher land to turn to. So when we think about success from the perspective of risk reduction, here are some takeaways. Across 17 cases, we found that planned relocation reduces risk, but it doesn't eliminate it, especially under higher emission scenarios and later in the century. This means the success of planned relocation is dynamic, it changes over time, and it's dependent on how seriously we take global climate action today. We also found that success depends on geographic context. Small island nations may not have safer land to turn to. This is an issue of climate injustice. The international community may need to consider support for small island nations that lack internal planned relocation alternatives. Success also depends on advanced planning. Strikingly, for 15 of the 17 cases that we studied, we could not find any assessments of risk of over the long term in destination sites before the move. We need to study future risk before we pick sites. Overall, understanding the level of risk reduction delivered in a planned relocation is a critical starting point for this success question. But it's not the whole story. If you're interested to learn more about this study, there's a preprint available at the QR code. Again, risk is one very narrow aspect of planned relocation success, albeit an important one. Indeed, people's exposure to hazards is very often related to their livelihoods, and relocating away from risk may involve serious disruptions to people's way of life. For example, are the fisher folk in Vuni de Lagoa in Fiji, the community that you see here, expected to become farmers overnight when they move from the coast to the mountainside? Together with my co-authors Anvesh, Gabrielle, and Chris, in this chapter we ask, what planning decisions are associated with improved livelihoods outcomes for relocated communities? So we turned back to that global database. We conducted a comparative analysis of all the cases that met certain criteria. They were initiated in relation to floods, this time riverine as well as coastal. They had completed their moves so we could assess outcomes. They followed that spatial pattern of one origin to one destination, and we could find adequate documentation. This last criteria means that we found at least one prior study where other researchers had interviewed relocated people through focus groups or a survey. We didn't have the chance to visit each of these cases, although that's vitally important, but instead we conducted a meta-analysis of sorts, synthesizing across the rich, in-depth case studies that had already been completed. Through synthesis of available scholarly and gray literature for each case, we systematically identified, coded, and calibrated information for certain planning decisions and outcomes for 14 cases that you see here. To assess livelihood outcomes, we chose the sustainable livelihoods approach. In contrast to understanding livelihoods in a conventional economic sense, this approach offers a more multidimensional understanding of human needs. Typically, this paradigm includes 5 categories. So in this case, that would mean if a community after relocating has access to better human assets, like a school or a hospital, social assets, like their community cohesion, physical assets, like their homes and school and physical buildings, financial assets, like access to markets and income, and natural assets, like food and water quality. And here we also add hazards, although that's not always included in this paradigm. And we also add a 6th category of cultural dimensions. Connection to land, heritage, ritual. These are understudied aspects of livelihoods, but they're essential to consider in planned relocation contexts, particularly for indigenous communities. This approach has previously been applied by other scholars in this field, including Anna Pagoma-Keller, who may be calling in right now. Hello. And it's well aligned with our objectives in this study. It enables us to assess the change in access to assets as a result of relocation through comparing cases with different baselines at the community scale. So what planning decisions did we consider? We turned to the literature and found 20-odd factors that are relevant, but chose 5 that were potentially the most important, that were consistently measurable across these cases, and they were viable for possible planning intervention. So, first, we expected that processes where community members are engaged at all stages, like in Gardaí Sugdub, where they were the ones who chose to move and chose where to move, are associated with more positive outcomes than when a government makes those decisions. This is based on increased control and agency. Second, we expected that transfer dynamics really mattered. A staggered approach, starting only with those most in need, can allow for voluntary immobility. But a synchronized approach can help minimize communities from falling apart. Third, fourth, and fifth, we also expected that distance, speed, and scale are important. So the literature has extensively studied each of these factors independently, but finds that they're all interdependent and mutually reinforcing. Therefore, we need to know how pathways or combinations of factors result in better or worse livelihood outcomes to make evidence-based decisions. To explore this question, we used fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis, FSQCA. This is a novel method that uses set theory to identify patterns and case characteristics that lead to certain outcomes. It's well suited to study complex causality and for medium-sized samples that are challenging to study with other methods. So this was the approach. 2 of us coded and calibrated all of the outcomes and planning decisions for the 14 cases. We weighted all of those outcome categories equally and identified causal pathways. What did we find? We found that community engagement is the single most important factor for determining improved livelihood outcomes, but that there were 2 contrasting paths for small and large communities. For larger communities, we found that community engagement over shorter time horizons led to better outcomes. For example, Val Meyer in the United States, residents served critical roles in site selection and site development, and within 8 weeks of the first floodwaters, 7 different committees composed of more than 100 village residents were created. In contrast, for smaller communities, we found that actually community engagement over longer time horizons with synchronized transfers led to better outcomes. For instance, in Vuni de Lagoa, Fiji, the entire community relocated as a unit and stayed together throughout the process. We wanted to make sure that these findings were not just because of how we coded the data. So we tried lots of different parameters, lots of different ways of calibrating, and in every robustness test, we found that community engagement was always the most important. So when we think about success from the perspective of livelihoods, this is what we learned. we learned that community engagement really matters for success. The more community members drive decisions, the better the outcomes. This is not new, but our study adds a systematic and a global comparative perspective to prior findings. Second, we found that the pace of relocation influences success, but in contrasting ways for small and large communities. And third, surprisingly, we found that distance mattered less than we expected it would, at least in this sample of cases. One possible explanation is that, as we saw in Chapter 2, elevation change matters more than horizontal distance. Another potential explanation is that there are other cultural or jurisdictional ideas of distance that make more of a difference than the absolute number of kilometers. If you're interested to read more about this study, again, you can find the QR code in the lower left part of the screen. And from this study, we learned that the categories of the sustainable livelihoods approach plus culture are critically important for evaluating climate-related planned relocation success. But again, while risk reduction and livelihoods are key parts of the story, again, they're not the whole story. Justice is also critical. In Ile-de-Jean-Charles, the case that you see here on the screen, an indigenous community off the coast of Louisiana here in the United States, justice means something very different if you ask indigenous scholars or if you ask the Louisiana state government. Everyone seems to agree that relocation should be just, but no one agrees on what that actually looks like. The perspectives of people moving are vitally important, as we learned in Chapter 3, but it's also important to understand how people working on relocation governance think about justice, because they're the ones who are framing the issues, designing programs, and creating policies that materially affect the lives of people undergoing relocation. So together with my co-authors, Siders, Caroline, Katie, and Gabrielle, we ask, what do researchers and practitioners think about justice? And why do they have varying views? Ideas of justice are complex and multidimensional with multiple subtypes. Our focus here is on distributive justice, how you allocate harms and benefits across a population, procedural justice, how meaningfully people are able to participate in decision-making processes, and recognitional justice. Do the decisions made reflect the values, cultures, and experiences of those affected? We turn to the literature, and as Siders has extensively documented, there are infinite questions related to these justice types that emerge in these contexts. But we found 5 that were particularly thorny. First, should relocation always be a measure of last resort in recognition of the harms of a lot of indigenous communities in particular that have previously been displaced? Or should it be the first option that's presented in recognition of the harms of climate change? Is relocation a net benefit or a net harm? When you have limited resources, how do you allocate them? To those who've been most exposed today, or those who have been historically most marginalized and underserved? From a procedural perspective, should these processes always be voluntary? And should they be initiated by communities or by governments? To explore these 5 questions, we recruited participants from a June 2021 Columbia University conference that attracted people from academia, from government, from nonprofit sectors. We chose focus groups because they allowed us to characterize what people think and why they agree and disagree. We used the Stanford platform for online deliberation to standardize the experience for participants and to minimize the biases of facilitators. So what do? We presented participants with 5 pairs of statements on these justice tensions from the previous slide, and then we studied their debates. We complemented these focus groups with a full group reflection over Zoom and before and after surveys. We found that views really varied on these justice tensions, and while every participant was unique, here are 2 examples. So sample participant A might say, actually, relocation, or as we're calling it in this study, retreat, is inherently a loss of something. It's a loss of home, a loss of land, it's a loss of history, it's a loss of connection. And therefore, it should not be used on indigenous communities or communities that face active discrimination. This is a measure of last resort. There are so many ways that this could go wrong from a justice perspective if it's not voluntary. And therefore, it should always be community initiated. Example participant B might come around and say, actually, retreat or relocation is a benefit as opposed to unmanaged retreat, which is panic and reactivity and loss. This is a net benefit. When it's a measure of last resort, it's just too late. Instead of patching things up year after year and disaster after disaster after disaster, this is prevention. Maybe this is what justice looks like in this context. And that maybe people should be forced to move if they're draining a community of all of their resources that could be going to low-income housing, and instead it's going to shore up billionaires on the beach. We found that many factors influenced views on these justice tensions. And after analyzing all of the transcripts and all of the survey results, we proposed this conceptual framework with two main categories. First, personal traits. We found that professional identities really influenced how people were thinking about what justice is and also their decisions. For example, more nonprofit and academics viewed it as a harm, whereas more government participants viewed retreat as a benefit. We also found that values really mattered. Participant 19 suggested that those who value the short term may focus more on the immediate harms, whereas those who focus on the future generations, may see the longer term benefits of retreat. But we also saw, second, that the ideas people had in mind, their imaginaries about what retreat looks like, the cases and the context of those cases in their minds, really influenced how people perceived justice. So for example, geographies mattered. More people imagining rural cases saw the harms. And historical context really mattered. Participants shared that the length and the depth of their cultural ties to a place, such as whether it's where a family has lived for generations, determined whether retreat should be viewed as a measure of last resort or not. Participants also shared that the marginalization of indigenous communities in the United States in particular has resulted in deep mistrust in the government, so this measure of last resort principle is essential. This shows that who relocates and under what political context also really influences how people are perceiving justice. So what do we learn from these divergent imaginaries? We see that justice is context-specific, and it's not just who or where a person is relocating that matters, it's also how long they have been connected to a specific place. History is critical. So I'm going to give you an example to hit this point home. Let's say person A is imagining Chief Nakin of the tribe of Ile de Jean Charles in Louisiana. He's had generational connections to this land. They arrived before risk was created in the first place. Person A will have a very different view of justice than person B, who's imagining Jeff Bezos or any other billionaire who's living in Miami-Dade County. This is one of 3 mansions that he has in Florida alone. It was recently built at a time when he was fully aware of sea level rise projections without any historic connection to this specific place. And there are high costs to the county to maintain this expensive bridge when it's washed away each year by storms. Person A and person B have very different visions of what justice looks like based on the spatial as well as the temporal context of their imaginaries. Strikingly, we observed changes in participants' views on justice after they engaged in dialogue with others. For example, in our focus groups, many participants repeated this mantra, this principle, that retreat is always a measure of last resort. But then in our post-workshop survey, 94% actually didn't say that it should be a measure of last resort. This was a really surprising finding that we had so much agreement. What's happening here? One possible explanation is that everyone went into these conversations with their imaginary, with a certain case in mind. But then they had discussions and learned about other people's imaginaries. And then in the post-workshop survey, some changed their mind. This suggests that intentional dialogue plays an important role, something that our participants recognized as well. Participant 26 said, "My perspectives didn't change, but the complexity of my thinking was opened up a bit. The discussions made me see more nuance." Participant 16 said, "I found myself changing my mind and perspective based on others' responses. It was good to gut check." So when we think about success from the perspectives of justice, What did we learn? Well, we learned that justice is context-specific. It varies across space and time. We also learned that people are not a monolith, and their visions of justice are also not a monolith. They vary by traits, they're who they are, and they also vary based on the imaginaries, the cases they have in mind. We found that when participants reflected on the context specificity of their own imaginaries, then they engaged in dialogue with others. They became more open-minded, they saw more nuance, and some changed their minds. Ultimately, talking to others, especially when we disagree, is necessary to advance justice aims in retreat policy and practice. And finally, from this chapter, we see that justice considerations are cross-cutting. They are integral to consider in relocation success. And examining institutional dimensions is critical for relocation outcomes. All right, I want to come back full circle to this central question. What does relocation success look like, and how do we measure it? Together with my co-author, Anna Pogoma-Keller, we argue that there is no easy scientific, social scientific, or political answer to this question. There is no easy way to navigate these waters. But rather than think about success, perhaps we need to ask about trade-offs. Trade-offs across populations. Successful for whom? The people relocating, or the people who stay behind, others in the new site? Successful according to whom? Who decides? How do we measure trade-offs across time? Are we thinking about the year 2030 or 2100, 2300? Think about trade-offs across domains. Is the goal merely for people to survive in these new sites, or for them to have the conditions that are required to thrive? We found that there are trade-offs across domains of livelihoods, risk reduction, and justice, and within these categories. To better explore such trade-offs, we need frameworks to measure all of these elements. So we looked to the literature to see what other frameworks exist from analogous contexts, like post-dam resettlement. But none was designed explicitly for climate-related planned relocation. So we proposed something new. We started with the elements that align with the Sustainable Livelihoods framework from Chapter 3. This includes the material, like whether or not people have the housing that they need, whether they have food and water security, but also the immaterial, whether or not they have health and well-being, social cohesion, and critically, culture. But there are some gaps. So from Chapter 2, we saw the critical importance of climate risk reduction, today and in the future. And from Chapter 4, we see the importance of the institutions that are required to navigate the justice tensions that inevitably emerge. We also see that justice outcomes are cross-cutting and can be considered within each of these dimensions. Recognition justice can be assessed if heritage is memorialized in the new site as a part of cultural outcomes, this category here. As previous scholarship, including by Ajabade et al., illustrate, evaluating success and failure is highly context-specific. We're not saying that this is a prescriptive right way to think about this. Instead, it's a library of tools, of methodologies, of indicators that other researchers and practitioners can use when they're thinking about monitoring these planned relocation cases over time. Monitoring outcomes holistically and longitudinally is essential to identify lessons learned, to see what makes these cases have better and worse outcomes. And we need to focus on trade-offs across domains. Interdisciplinarity is key. Now I want to ground us again in the example from the start of this presentation. Think back to Gardi Sugdub, the indigenous community in Panama facing rising sea levels. Their move is slated for later this month, May 29th. Will they be the next success story or not? I hope I've illustrated that these are perhaps the wrong questions to ask. Planned relocation and all forms of human movement are double-edged swords with both serious challenges but also potential opportunities. There are trade-offs. Everyone wants to stay home, but some movement may be inevitable as climate change accelerates. We as a society, as researchers, as policymakers, have to prepare. We have to plan to make sure that when people have to, they can move with dignity. We need bold imagination about transformative futures. I argue that it is possible to recognize these trade-offs and still aspire towards planned relocation that not only makes people safer, it also improves infrastructure, enables sustainable livelihoods, addresses historical inequities, and creates foundations for more just futures. Time is of the essence. The window in which we can ask big questions, dream imaginatively, and learn about what makes these moves have better outcomes is quickly closing. We need to learn from the past, but also not be confined by it. We need evidence-based and imaginative, rights-respecting policies today to help people move or stay with dignity tomorrow. After all, to fail to plan is to plan to fail. Thanks. Thank you all. Yeah, I'm just going to leave this slide with some takeaways on the screen for our Q&A session.
Thank you. This is really super fascinating. I was really struck by your, I can't remember which chapter was early on, where you talk about the different spatial contexts for relocation and how in a kind of in a nation like the Maldives, for example, there might not be the possibility to actually eliminate risk by relocating within the country. And so I've been thinking about the role of international organizations in this context, and I'd kind of be curious to hear more about, what role you might be able to see them playing, or what role they are playing in trying to kind of emphasize this, practice of success in the ways you've outlined.
Thanks, Lihi. I think this is a really, really important question, and a piece of work that I wasn't able to talk about today, together with my co-author Rachel Harrington-Abrams, really dives deep into this question of what is the role of international organizations in this context. I'll just share this slide, which shows, I promise Lihi wasn't a plant. When you look to that global mapping, we see that there is a missing link, right? Every case has a different international organization that's supporting it. It might be GIZ in Fiji, and then IOM in the Solomon Islands. We see ad hoc siloed support. And that leads to coordination gaps between those organizations. They can't necessarily share best practice, but also accountability gaps between those organizations and the countries and the communities that they're trying to serve. So I think this is the critical question. What is the role of the international community? I think this is what we need to tackle in the years ahead, and that increased coordination and increased measures to hold these organizations accountable is essential. Thank you.
All right, we have a question up front and then one in the back.
Thank you, Erica. It's been so fun watching this grow up over the years that you've been here, and watching you present different parts of this with our environmental justice and human rights group. I realized a question I never have asked you over all the times I've seen bits of this is just on the fundamentals. Why did you start in 1970 with your database? And what was that? Practical, just like where data was available, or is there a meaningful reason with sort of the change in what we're seeing worldwide with planned relocation that 1970 is significant? And I'm curious if you have any further reflections out of that, out of not having data from before 1970.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting question. The answer is relatively boring. I think that was where we had data. There was a natural break. There were a lot of cases from the 20s and the 30s, and then there was nothing for a very long period. And then after 1970, there was an acceleration of cases. So this database maps planned relocations that were initiated in relation to disasters. So it includes earthquakes, it includes tsunamis, it includes volcanoes, hazards that aren't necessarily explicitly linked to climate change in the way a weather-related hazard might be. And we found that there were a lot of historical cases initiated for colonial motivations and mining, especially in small island countries. But for whatever reason, post-1970, there were a lot more disaster-related cases. Yeah.
Erica, thank you so much for this research. This was amazing. I feel inspired and excited to go out and do research, which can be difficult in a PhD sometimes. I wanted to ask about your analysis of, risk at starting point, risk at ending point. And one of the things that I'm especially thinking about is sort of, I'm imagining a scenario where a community escapes sea level rise and goes to a community that is not at risk, as much risk of sea level rise, but is then suddenly hit by a drought. Like what kind of, cross-cutting risk of, hazards are you thinking about maybe, for future work, and how do we sort of think about like the various ways that climate change will show up in vulnerable communities?
Yeah, I think this is also an amazing question, because I don't think we have risk assessment approaches that necessarily are thinking about the long term in multi-hazard risk contexts. So this analysis was just focused on sea level rise and annual flooding, but we know that, as you just mentioned, there are so many hazards that are at play. The community of Gardi Sugdub in Panama, for instance, their new site has experienced a lot of erosion during heavy rains. How do we factor that into consideration when we're making these decisions? I think we need to have more robust approaches to assess new sites. Some future work I'd be interested in undertaking is actually asking relocation planners, where are you getting your information? How are you making these decisions? And to what extent are you recognizing indigenous and local knowledge about these hazards in addition to scientific expertise, sort of questioning who's the expert in those assessment processes? Thanks.
All right, I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you, Erica. I'm wondering, to the extent that you've come across this in your studies, who pays as a question? And if you could just give us an overview of the case studies that you know a little more about and maybe the future direction, especially considering the question about international community involvement.
Yeah, I mean, that's the elephant in the room. Who pays? In this database of cases, we saw a very wide spectrum. So the government of Fiji, in addition to developing a national policy on planned relocation, they also developed standardized operating procedures and a trust fund. So there is actually a tax where all citizens of Fiji pay in to a bucket that goes to support these communities, and they're also accepting donations from New Zealand and other countries to support these community-led moves. We also see a range of other donors, a lot of bilateral support from USAID or GIZ, CEDA. We see a great deal of creativity. Some communities that have crowdsourced, that have started a GoFundMe page. Others who have turned to the private sector. In the Philippines, I remember one case where a TV company sponsored a relocation site. I don't think there is one fund. There's not going to be one loss and damage fund post-COP28 that will be able to fund all of these moves. Instead, we'll see a mosaic of different adaptation, loss and damage development sources.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for the wonderful questions. Erica, we'll turn it back to you for a few minutes, and then I'll have a few moments at the end for closing.
Yeah? Okay, should I do my acknowledgements now?
You should.
Okay. Thank you all for being here. It means a lot to me, and you on Zoom as well. One of the things that I find most fascinating about planned relocation is that it's conceptualized at this community scale. And similarly, this body of work was very much a community effort. First, I would like to express deep gratitude to my dissertation committee and chair, Chris. Thank you for always asking the most thought-provoking questions and for modeling how to lead with humility and curiosity. Gabrielle, thank you for making me feel like I belonged here at Stanford and for reassuring me in moments of uncertainty time and time again. Siders, thank you for coming all this way to be here and for pushing me to question my assumptions. Michelle, thank you for your inspiring commitment to environmental justice and for being a champion of this work since day one. And Nicole, thank you for your wholehearted support and for being such a wonderful chair. I feel so lucky to have had such brilliant scholars and patient, kind-hearted human beings as mentors. Thank you to Anvesh, Sydney, and Sonia for making countless hours on NVivo and ArcGIS so much more enjoyable. Thank you to the incredible Sanjula Weerasinghe, who was with me from day one in this work, to Scott, to Katie, to Caroline and Anna for the rich insights and invaluable teamwork. These manuscripts would not have been possible without all of you. Thank you to the Wong Perotti Lab and the Field Lab, and to the Environmental Justice and Human Rights Lab, to Emily, Sybil, Jesse, and Penelope in particular for encouraging me to center justice in this work and stay connected to movements beyond our campus's borders. Thank you to the ever-supportive E-IPER team for making this program such a welcoming place. This includes those present, in particular, Anne-Marie and Berlin, Anna and Mele, but also those past. I feel so fortunate to have been part of this special, special program. Thank you to the phenomenal E-IPER community, including various dissertation and accountability groups, and my stellar 2019 cohort. Will, Bianca, Cesar, Megan, and Kieran. I won the lottery to be in community with you all. And special shout out to Megan for being there to help me navigate all of the choppy waters of this dissertation and pick out this necklace. I'm extremely grateful to the emerging Stanford Climate Displacement Group. Watching our ragtag crew grow and then this year culminate in hosting a conference and a class has been one of the most rewarding parts of my time at Stanford. But this dissertation exists in an ecosystem of experiences beyond the farm that have also shaped these ideas. I'm grateful to all the community leaders, researchers, and government officials, representatives of NGOs and agencies who have shared their stories and insights with me. In particular, thank you to the United Nations University Climate Academy on planned relocation, for colleagues at the Platform on Disaster Displacement, Human Rights Watch, and the Calder Center Climate Mobility Hub. I would not be asking these research questions if it were not for all of you, and in particular for Sanjula, Beth, and Jane. Thank you for your enduring support and mentorship. But also, thank you to people who've been incredibly influential in my life farther back. My high school AP Environmental Sciences teacher, Miss Wolfer, thank you for tuning in. And for Ruth, Susanna, and Roger, mentors from undergrad and my master's. To Mickey and Yolanda, Rachel, and Betsy, thank you for the sisterhood along this interdisciplinary dissertation journey. Ooh. To Aya and Box of Rain, thank you for showing me what concepts that I study, like home and community, feel, sound, and taste like each day. Thank you for all the crowded tables. To my adventure partner, Santi, for encouraging me to question what success means in all domains of life. And for supporting me to explore further and smile wider along this journey. And to all of your family as well for being so supportive these last weeks. To Justin, my brother, no longer so little, thank you for helping me stay grounded and reminding me to laugh. To my parents, Ronnie and Bill, who have always encouraged me to ask questions and pursue the path towards answers, no matter how far off the beaten trail they might take me. You sacrificed so much to make my education possible, and this PhD was only imaginable thanks to your enduring love and support. To so many more friends who feel like family and family who feel like friends, you know who you are. Thank you. And finally, in preparing for this talk and reflecting on Leahy's words a few weeks ago, I want to thank my ancestors who themselves made challenging migration decisions, fleeing persecutory pogroms in Russia and the Irish potato famine to arrive at Angel Island and Ellis Island and pursue a better life in melting pot America across the sea. They endured serious losses, of that I'm sure, but they also had hope and saw migration as an opportunity. I am grateful to all those whose shoulders I stand on today.